Bruce Ackerman with Idaho Fish and Game. Thank you all for coming. It's great to talk to someone. Evie challenged us to speak up in the first 5 minutes, so I'm going to.
Yay!
Evie, I wanted to ask you a question, because you and I have a very similar career path. I think more than the others, you have a path of coming up through wildlife, masters at Idaho with Jim Peak, working with Idaho Fish and Game for several years as a researcher with Lon Cook. A couple of individuals we could agree are probably crusty. You went on to UW with PhD, so all in big game. So that's a pretty unusual time. Not many women in that path. So tell us something about maybe your mentors or good experiences, bad experiences you had.
Well, being in big game was interesting. And I'll tell an anecdote or a little story. When I first worked for Idaho Fish and Game, the first regulation setting meeting I ever went to, and this is literally true, there was a group of guys over here and me. And they were talking about hunting. So the first pressure I felt was, okay, I don't hunt. In fact, I started hunting, and I will admit it right up front that I started hunting so I could communicate with my colleagues, and I felt included in their conversations. It took me about 5 years, though, to say, am I really doing this for me, or am I doing this for something else? And I was a waterfowl hunter, and actually, it took me into habitats, and anybody who's a waterfowl hunter, you get up at the crack of dawn and you see the wings go up as you enter the marsh, and you go up and the birds take up, and it's just the most incredible experience. Now, you don't have to hunt to do that, but hunting gets you out there, and it does do that. So, how did I get started? So, I guess my point is that being in big game, I had benefits and barriers, but I had some tremendous mentors, as you brought up, Bruce. Jim Peak, as I've already told you, he allowed me to take a right-hand turn in my career, and I wouldn't be here today if that weren't so. So I have to give him a lot of credit. But Lon Cook, who's not here, and probably the crustiest guy I've ever met, and those of you who know him, I love him to death, because he promoted me in every single way he possibly could. He gave me the freedom to fail. And that was often at times a tough thing. But I learned from that, and he continued to support me. And Dick Tabor, who was my PhD advisor, the good thing about Dick was he couldn't hear because he was a gunner during the war. So you could tell him all kinds of things, and he would just sit there and watch. And you could go off and do what you wanted. So they were very supportive as well. So I have to say that in my career, as early as it was, I've had some great mentors. I've had some women mentors who were more role models than mentors, I would say. Just because working in big game, I worked with a lot of men. So I could go on for hours, but I think I'll stop there. But thanks for the question, Bruce.
I'm short. My name is Trisha Hotshevin, and I work for Idaho Department of Fish and Game. And we were having a small sidebar conversation after your talks. Could you, each one of you, define? People think of mentorship in different ways. So what does mentorship mean to you? And could you give us an example of one of your most positive mentoring experiences?
I don't want to start.
Think about that.
Yeah. I'll start.
So I guess I would say from my perspective, that is one of the things. I have had multiple mentors along the way, and each of those have varied somewhat. So there's no, for me, one defined what that looks like. I think there was a couple comments that were made later in the day, which I think rang really true for me, which was at different times in my career, I needed different things. And so it was finding those people that I could connect with. And I would say sometimes both ways. It was because I recognized that, and sometimes it was because other people recognized that I needed something. And they were brave enough and inclusive enough to come to me and offer their help. So it's varied for me all across the board. When I talk about mentoring experiences, you say one that really makes a difference. I think the first management position that I had, there was an opening that came about, and I would have never in a million years considered myself ready to apply for that. And somebody who had been with the firm for a very long time came in and said to me, I hope you're gonna apply for that position. And I said, oh, no, not even considering it. And he said, let's talk about this, because I really think this is something you should do. Whether you get the position or not, this is a great opportunity. And I would have never done that. And he worked with me prior to the interview process. He'd been there a long time. He really talked about what they were looking for. And I ultimately applied for, and in fact, got the job. But without a doubt, without his encouragement, I would have not gone there.
So the mentor I'm thinking about is actually a woman. To turn the tables a little bit, the woman who got me into doing my training and organizational consulting career is a woman named Shirley Stocco. And she, you never know when you're going to meet the people that are going to affect your life. She was actually my parents' next door neighbor, and I met her at a Christmas party. And we ended up talking in a kitchen about what she did, and she was running around the world and Hawaii and all over the place doing consulting and training. And she asked me a little bit about me, and she said, and she knew that I loved to teach. She said, what's your favorite part of teaching? And I said, it's the relationship. And she right away said, you get it. I want to help you get started with something. And she helped me start my career. So I think a mentor is somebody who sees something in you that maybe you haven't seen yourself, and encourages you to take those risks and helps you find opportunities to apply your strengths. And Shirley changed my life by doing that. So.
In a quick response, I was at an advanced grant meeting several years ago, and there was a panel of women physicists, and they were individuals in their department. There was only one woman, and in physics. And they looked around and they realized they wanted mentors. How do I get a mentor? And they had questions specific to being women in physics. So they went to other institutions and they formed this interesting little collaboration of about 5 physicists from 5 different institutions, the northeast corner of the nation. So they weren't even proximal to each other, but they engaged in conversation. We've got technology that makes this readily available to us so that these isolated individuals can actually have meaningful and consistent relationships. I took that model to me because at that point I was the co-PI on this advanced grant, and we were asked to engineer institutional change. And I'm like, I'm at a research-intensive institution as a middle manager person. How the heck am I going to engineer institutional change? And there was only one of me in this position at this institution, but I knew there were institutions all around the nation that had been received advanced grants. So I started what was called the Advanced Implementation Mentors Network. And I say that by way of example. This network was a lifeline. And I think that if you can craft opportunities for individuals, whether it be at positional levels or that have a collective interest, they will serve as a phenomenal vehicle for mentoring around a variety of issues that will come into your lap as a professional individual. So I invite you to continue to think about mentorship as something that happens in a collective possibly, and even not defined by space or time. You can do it in a variety of very unique ways.
Yeah, I would just ditto my colleagues up here in that there's no real definition in my mind either with what makes a good mentor, what is mentorship. They come at various times of your life. sometimes when you don't even realize that they are a mentor to you until years down the road. So I would totally agree with your definition on that. For me, a mentor that resonates for me is my father, who's also a wildlife biologist. But within my career, I've had one particular Forest Service biologist that I will never forget. And he wasn't, Forest Service Biologist of the Year. He wasn't a superstar, published sort of biologist, but he was the first biologist that I worked for. His name was Tom Comerick. And he recognized that the importance, at least within the Forest Service, is I was this graduate student that was going to save the world, and amphibians was all I cared about, and I was going to teach everybody in fire and everybody in range and all the different things and multi-uses in the Forest Service, that wildlife was the ultimate thing the Forest Service needed to be thinking about, and everything else was just beneath it. And he took me aside and he said, I think I'm going to send you out this summer and you're going to work on a hand crew. And you're going to spray weeds, and you're going to clean up an illegal camp in the wilderness, and you're going to write tickets. And I sort of resented that my first summer, because I'm supposed to be doing wildlife work. But, 15 years down the road now, I have been able to engage in those areas that I never would have been able to do in a meaningful way. Otherwise, I understood their language. I understood how to communicate with them. I had been in the trenches with them. And I think that's a really important thing in a mentor, that he saw that I needed, he made it happen. And like I said, to this day, now I appreciate it, not so much at the time. So.
Well, I think everything that I was going to say has been said, but in a nutshell, I think to me a good mentor is someone who takes someone aside, watches their skill set, and communicates that to them. It tells them what qualities they have that are above average, and tells them where they excel and where they can make a difference. And then once they get that trust, also in a tactful way, communicates what skills they need to improve upon. And so I think for myself, and I think for many folks, we don't have a lot of overconfidence that's overflowing sometimes. We don't recognize, a lot of people don't recognize their own strengths until someone points it out to them in a leadership position or in a supervisory position. I think a lot of people don't do that. They don't take someone aside and say, look, these are the areas that you are above average, and these are the areas that you excel, and here are the few areas that if you can improve upon these other areas, you can really become a leader. And I think we can all do more of that, and to me that's all it takes to be a mentor.
Well, I think the only thing I have to add to that is I think it's a two-way street, that a mentor gains a lot out of mentoring. And I know that I have. And so I would argue that whether it's male or female, that you learn about different people, their strengths, their weaknesses, how to promote them in spite of that, and encourage them along the way. And I know I've learned as much from my students as they've learned from me, and oftentimes I would say more. And it's that diversity through time that have kept me very interested in students and mentoring.
Morning, everyone. I'm Kurt Jenkins. Hi, Evie. I work with U.S. Geological Survey out of Corvallis OSU campus, stationed up in Washington. I wanted a brief story and then a question. My wife and I, some of you may know Patty, we met in graduate school at Oregon State University about 35 years ago, both in the wildlife program. 35 years later, we're still married. We are both professional wildlife biologists. We're very fortunate. I consider myself to be one of the luckiest people alive. I think Patty does too. And if I look back on your career, I see us both working in the profession as a result of some very key individuals who saw some strengths in us and tried to give us each opportunities. And in terms of allowing me to hire my wife as a field assistant, and my wife being able to hire me as a field assistant in our early careers, and then trying to facilitate dual career transfers within the government to where we both work for different agencies in the same small town. So I key it all in as to a series of individuals who have made this happen for us, not as a result of any kinds of policies or procedures. So I agree with everything that's been said today that a key is developing this culture of supporting people like me and my wife. But I wondered if any of you had any examples of movement in terms of procedure or policy rather than just the support of key individuals to try to make it work for a couple of their students who they have supported.
I guess one of the biggest things has been spousal hires. And I have to bring that out because I went through a nasty one and I went through a great one. And spousal hires are what are going to help dual career, at least in academia, because if you're both in research and you're in academia, you're there because of the university. So from our standpoint, policies there do make a difference. And that doesn't mean the person doesn't have to be qualified and doesn't have to compete and doesn't have to produce and doesn't have to make tenure. All those, but it is opening that door to recognizing that you have dual couples, and when they're both qualified, that it really does facilitate those things. So in the academic world, there is that spousal hire. I would put a checkbox next to it.
All right, I'm going to practice a little bit of that authenticity. So I'm going to take my line officer hat because I'm always told to be careful what I say in front of the public. But the reality of it is, I think the Forest Service, I'm only going to speak for the Forest Service because that's what I know in my career, is if we kind of are a family-oriented. The Forest Service family is what we call each other, and we kind of take care of each other, so to speak. And dual careers, I think, in the past have been quite supported. My husband's a rangeland specialist, so we have been fortunate enough to be able to move and find jobs on the same forest. Currently, we're finding ourselves challenged, and we've been told that now that we've reached a certain level in our careers that one of us is going to have to make a sacrifice for the other. And we've been well aware of that for years, that may be the case, but those sacrifices, it's more of a negative tone now in the agency. And I think a lot of what's going on, at least in the government and the Forest Service, is that somebody somewhere did something that wasn't fair, and then a policy ensued, and kind of everyone's sort of suffering from it in the process. So there's a lot of chain of command that you have to go through and approvals that you have to go through in order to get dual careers and yada, 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 rather than just you have two great qualified individuals, why wouldn't you do this? So I think the perception is that if you have a spouse that happens to work on the same unit as you, particularly, I'm just use myself an example. I'm in a decision-making role. My husband's in range, which is a very controversial public land. So am I going to be skewed in any way relative to the work that he does? And I think that's a valid concern. But to just preface that ahead of time without looking at, people's past history and getting to know who they are and interview processes and their resumes, I think is a very unfair way to do that. And I think the agency has a way to go and getting back on board to support dual careers. Is it still happening in the Forest Service? Yes, it is. It's just more rare. And again, there's just this kind of gridlock situation we're in right now where it does seem to be more regional forester approval, and it's happening less and less. So movement in the Forest Service is just not happening as much as it was in the past.
So for those of you that were here earlier when you heard me speak, I mentioned the fact that I've been in the profession for 25 years and I've only had one female supervisor. And in fact, that female supervisor that I have is my current female supervisor that I got when I moved from DEQ over to the Nature Conservancy. So I would say a couple of reflections on when you talk about policy or an organization. I would say it's the only organization I've ever worked for where, in fact, we do have somebody who is in charge of diversity. It's an organization that openly talks about this issue, which was very new to me and quite refreshing. But it is clearly forefront in the organization, and it gives us a forum, it gives us a template to work from. And so it is a constant conversation at the senior management levels and throughout. And there is a structure around what we need to do and what sort of policies and venue that people can go to in order to ensure that there is this opportunity for diversity. So that's one example.
I have a few things, I guess, that I could comment on. I heard, I think work flex time is huge, and obviously that can come in a lot of different ways, but one specific example that I recall, I had two colleagues that in another state where I live that were both working for the same state agency, but they were working in two separate offices. Their jobs were in two separate offices that were 2 hours apart. And so one of the two members of the couple asked if they could work from that other office 1 day a week and report to that office 1 day a week. And their supervisor said no, and that they kept making that request as many times as they felt they could tactfully, and the answer kept coming back no. The individual was being wooed by other agencies. They got a job offer from a federal agency offering a substantially higher pay. They again went back to their supervisor and said, look, I prefer to stay here in the state agency, but this is important to me. My wife and I live 2 hours apart. We both work for your agency. I'm just asking for 1 day a week to report to the other office. They still said no, and so of course they lost them both. So, I think flexibility in the workplace is important, and it gets, it means basically setting policy that you have exceptions to, because if you have a policy that prevents that, you need to revisit your policy. The other thing I think that I've noticed is some agencies have in-house daycare. A lot of people, when they have children, their number one priority switches from their profession, and their profession becomes their second priority in life, and that's just a reality. And so when I was at the University of Arizona, they had a in-house program that if your child was sick or your daycare that you have broke down, you could call 15 minutes in advance of going to work, and they had a network of approved people that they would send to your house and do daycare. They had a limit on how many times per year you could use that service, and it was available for faculty and staff alike, but the people that used it, to them it was a lifesaver. They did not have to take a sick day. They did not have to take a leave, a day of leave, and that was a program that was supported by the university, and it was huge to the people who had young children. It was it just really endeared them to their employer. And I would say the last thing is training in awareness of supervisors. Is, I forget who it was, Toni or somebody said that first line supervisor, the one immediately above you, is really what makes it or breaks it on whether you're going to retain that individual in the workplace. And this half a day workshop is great, but I think if it's an issue that's brought up annually in all organizations and discussed by supervisors on what they can do to promote and be tolerant and be flexible to allow the kind of situations that you mentioned, Kurt, that's another thing that we can do.
And I'd only add one more thing. I really appreciated your comment on your comments in all three of those areas, specifically around flexibility, but also around marketing and training and engagement of middle managers or people that are immediate supervisors. The other piece that I think a policy affords, specifically if it's a flexible policy, but even if not, it affords the fact that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. These are common things that people experience, dealing with childcare, managing dual career contexts. Why does each couple in this situation have to reinvent the wheel with the agency? So having an awareness around common things that affect the employees, if we've got policy around that, that's a great place to start. And you can then leverage from that starting place into other conversations. For example, there's policies that facilitate dual career hires of job sharing. But sometimes, depending on the agency or the individual supervising, they might not even be cognizant of that being an option. So being aware of a variety of policies that support dual career hires or support family-friendly practices then facilitates a conversation that might not otherwise be had or available. So.
Good morning. My name is Rita Dixon, and I've been in this field for 28 years. I currently work for the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and I really appreciated hearing about the biological differences in our brains, and also just talking about, various traits, and that women don't necessarily need to become men, and vice versa. And so over the course of the years I've been in this field, I have at times been called uppity, a troublemaker, and belligerent, all when presenting an alternative point of view and asking essential questions. So I think oftentimes, in the field of science, we're trained to question and ask the right questions. So I would like to hear from all of you in terms of how we might change the perception that when women ask those questions, they're a problem.
You want to take that one?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and I see this in every industry that I work with, that when, and it was alluded to in some of the presentations, that when women assert themselves, they're often seen as being troublemakers. And what I will tell you is that there's a quote that well-behaved women rarely make history. So, I would, part of what I go out and try to do is say, look, there's lots of different ways that we can all be effective, and hopefully what we can do is become aware that it's easy for us to have a bias that when women stand up that somehow that's not a positive trait. Yet when men do the exact same thing, it's seen as assertive and he's exercising leadership. The more we become aware of that, hopefully we can change that bias, but it's having the conversation like we're having today and having it over and over. Is that really somebody who is not behaving appropriately, or are we letting our own biases affect the way that we see that? And hopefully the more we talk about it, the more that behavior becomes welcome from both genders, because it's more about where you're coming from and what you're intending to have happen. And hopefully we can change the impact so that it has the impact that you're looking for. But that's knowing ourselves and understanding that we may have that biologically based reaction that says, oh, women are supposed to be quiet. Is that true? Is that really what's supposed to happen? And I really don't think that that's what we want as organizations. I think we want everybody to have the courage and also to be supported in standing up for what they think is right and having passion about what we do. So it's looking at ourselves, and hopefully this type of conversation starts that process.
One quick comment too about uppity women. They do change. It's frightening to be an uppity woman. You gotta. Yes. I want to give you a round of applause.
Yes, absolutely.
It's hard to be an uppity woman. And at the same time, I invite us all to make it easier for each of us to have a voice and to look around the table and say who is missing from the table, who hasn't had an opportunity to speak and invite that person to speak. And by inviting, you honor their contribution rather than craft a context. Well, all the important people have spoken, so we don't need to engage any more conversation. And there comes that uppity woman again, giving her unsolicited, unwanted piece. Let's change the context and invite that feedback.
I think I've heard it said that you're not doing your job unless someone's mad at you.
Yeah, I would concur with everyone up here. I've dealt with the same sorts of biases when I've both been a biologist and asked the tough questions, as well as now being in the ranger role for 3 years and being the only woman within the ranger group of my leadership team, all of which are tenured over 10, 15 years in rangering and are pretty even keeled. The perception, they're so even keeled and so calm, and you're just, maybe you just need some time to just, you're so green and you just need some time to just kind of filter into the ranger game. And I've been told on a number of occasions that I'm overly emotional and that I probably wouldn't be a good leader. And the emotion was all driven on 2 occasions that I can think of. One, when those of you that know the Halstead fire was threatening the town of Stanley. And I wouldn't say that I was running through the streets with my hair on fire, but I was quiet, I was pensive, and I was direct. So if that's emotional, if the job got done, then I guess I'm guilty of that. The other was for me last year with the fatalities of Grand Mountain. The other shot crew was off my district, and that assistant soup is a very dear friend of mine, and I had been in dialogue with him the night of the fatalities. So when we were discussing the fatalities with our employees, I got emotional about it. And that was another time that it was brought to my attention as maybe that's not a strong leadership quality. And I struggled with that for a good 6 months and started doubting myself and the non-event side of what we talked about today. And I realized that there's strength in passion, there's strength in leadership, and there's strength in inspiration. And the employees came back to me and said, that was meaningful, that meant you cared. And so I just let it go, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I'm going to be who I am, and that's just the way it's going to be.
I was just going to add that I think, again, those are those opportunities for all of us to speak up and challenge those biases. I mean, I have been in conversations where people have said something similar to me about someone else. She's very abrasive, or you're in a meeting and they say that. And my question to them afterwards has been, and insert whatever name you want, if John had said that, would we be having the same conversation? And that really forces people to really sort of stop and ponder that question. And I think that's the thing that we can all do collectively, is challenge those kinds of things when we hear that, to really make people stop and ask themselves whether they do in fact have an unconscious bias about that issue.
With their parents, how do we get them involved in that early, I like the power thing, which was passion and purpose, and that seems to come way early in the segments. How do we as agencies and universities engage the very young?
I'm just going to go back to the research. It says that our personalities and who we are and our habits are often formed by the time we're 3 years old. And so if we're not getting kids out and about by then, it may be too late. I think we often start that after the fact, maybe by kindergarten, and try to get them out, but oftentimes the families are already in habits and have formed habits for their kids by the time they're 3. So you're in the field. I'm just going to throw that out there and say, are we getting kids out when they're really little? Are we getting young parents out? And how do we get the young parents out there into nature? Because we know that nature changes the biology of our brains in really positive ways. So that's my thought, not really an answer, but a question.
I guess I would add to that, I think some of the things that we talked about for women, men, regardless of what age, again, is that inclusivity, you know? And so I think about the fact, I was reading once where they're talking about one of the challenges with young women going into science is oftentimes that science is created or visualized as the sole man, you know, sitting in his dark laboratory doing very important scientific work, but all by himself, right? And that's not going to appeal to everybody. But if you can see that as more inclusive in the collaboration and how you challenge each other, then you're opening up a demographic of other people saying, I might like science, but I wouldn't like science if I had to do it all by myself. I may not like hunting and fishing if I have to do it all by myself, but if I have a friend along or I have somebody else I can share that experience with or relate to, I think that opens up the door for more of that as well, again, starting at a younger age.
I think that's a really important problem, and that problem's going to get worse as our society becomes more urban. A couple things. I think we have to force our children to go outdoors sometimes. You know, it's a constant battle with me and my young boys about electronics. I don't yell at my children very often, but when I do, it's about their use of electronics. And they ask me regularly, why do you hate my electronic device so much?
The answer is because you love them so much.
You know, when my wife was growing up, her father forced her to go duck hunting regularly. She talks about that routinely. I forced my kids to go fishing when they were a young age. It didn't take them long to then beg me to take them fishing. You know, we force our kids to go to school. We force our kids to go to the dentist. We force our kids to do many things that they don't want to do. We need to force them to go outdoors sometimes because the kids think they don't like something frequently. We need to force them. So no matter how much they say they don't want to go outdoors, you need to force them. And your grandchildren, you need to force your granddaughter to go outdoors. The other thing we can do is, you know, my father used to pile not just my brother and I, but 6 neighbors into the car every weekend and go fishing. You know, it was a time when seatbelts were there just to beat your brother. And so, you know, don't just take your kid or your grandkid outdoors. Take their friends, because then they will like it more. It becomes more fun when they have their friends with them. So we need to compensate for parents who aren't doing that by taking other kids with us.
I think as an outsider, I would also say expand one's consciousness about the outdoors. I think it can get very narrow to fishing and hunting when that's what you're doing, but I also think that simply getting outside and going to the neighborhood stream and counting the number of water bugs or whatever it is that gets you outside, canoeing, expanded bird watching, and I think as we expand that consciousness, we could also expand the revenue consciousness, because we're building in folks that engage the outdoors, and as fish and game people, how can we expand our understanding of what it means to be in the outdoors to legitimize other ways that can form a base of support for the agency too, as we build it in the new generation.
I don't have children of my own, but I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and my siblings like to ship them off to my house. And up until recently, Stanley only had cell coverage just within the town, so it worked out great. So I'm certainly not advocating or saying y'all should ship your kids to Stanley, and I'll take care of them, but there's a lot of really awesome programs, and we've been kind of working with the Stanley School. I mean, those kids inherently, they live, breathe, sleep it every day. How can we get more of the urban kids more involved? And so there's lots of different outreaches that we're doing in those arenas. But if you have, you know, I think we take for granted that we're in this field, but if you have siblings or you have friends that are doing something cool, you know, maybe pick up that phone and ask them if you can ship your kids off for that weekend and get them a little bit of exposure, because, yeah, my siblings don't have any issue with that at all. So.
As the co-chair of the Be Outside Idaho Coalition, thank you very much for saying what you just said. My name is Vicki Renaud with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and I've been accused at times, not actually within my own agency to my knowledge of being one of those outspoken women, but I was for another agency years ago, and then my park manager had a heart attack. I saved his life, and I could say whatever I wanted to. I think it's absolutely fabulous that we're raising awareness of this issue, and it is so nice to see so many of my wonderful colleagues here learning about gender bias and what we can do for it. And it probably is something that we'll always spend a lot of time raising awareness. That raising awareness piece is very, very important. My question to each of you is, how do we then, particularly within agencies, as we all know, tend to move rather glacially in policy procedural changes, what are some small steps that we can all engage in to help our collective agencies move forward to solving some of these problems, to creating a better workplace for all of us? Thank you very much.
Is Beth moderator? Beth, I think she allowed a fabulous segue for the work that you've already begun to launch. And I think that is, there currently is a document that is, I think, a valuable place to start. You've got in-house things that are already happening. No, don't start with new things. Start with energy that's already been gathered and do something with that work. Someone had shared with me that document had come out, that Beth had crafted such a fabulous piece of work, and that they felt that it was languishing and it wasn't going anywhere. And it's like, okay, then let's do something with the work that we already have in place. And so that would be one place that I'd start is reviewing and supporting that work. Beth, did you want to have a comment to that at all?
Yeah.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
So that was based on a workshop that I suggested to our Wildlife Bureau leadership, and they jumped on to bring, Gretal came in to facilitate a workshop of our Wildlife Bureau female employees. We were up in Coeur d'Alene for our fall Bureau meeting. And the idea was to kind of look at ways to facilitate more recruitment of leadership and support of women in the Wildlife Bureau, because we're a fairly small minority of the employees, the full-time employees. And there are other bureaus in our outfit where that percentage is even diminished from that. And I honestly, Rita said she's been around for 28 years, and I've been in some other agencies for that long. This was the first time that I'd ever addressed my women colleagues on that issue of gender bias, and it felt really good. That was an empowering and I could just call it a cathartic session, because we had not had those conversations. And so what we did in like a mere 2-hour workshop this week, we just kind of came up with some questions like what are some of the barriers that exist in our agency, and how can we overcome those? We wanted it to be very constructive. We didn't want a whiny session. There was no whiners allowed. And we even had men kind of knocking on the door. This man right here came in, and we turned him away, and I've never felt so bad about anything, I swear to God, in my life. But we needed to have that really intimate conversation first, and so we didn't have any barriers. And we came up with an extensive list of issues that were potential barriers, an extensive list of things that we could do proactively to recommend to our leadership. So I kind of summarized that. We took a post-workshop survey, and then I presented it to the director's office. And I felt that it was the director's office prerogative to distribute that report as they saw fit. And so that's where it is right now. And I hope we can move forward. We're kind of itching to move forward. Jim.
In my defense, I distributed that document to our leadership team within an hour of getting it.
I'm Kerry Reese from the University of Idaho, and Tom, I really appreciated your presentation. I've been married for 40 years, and because of your anatomical and neurological explanation of the differences in brains, I now understand why sometimes I don't understand. But more importantly, my question is this. I've known a lot of women faculty members, a lot of women staff members at the University of Idaho, and in my college, I've had many of those women over the last 30 years say, I would rather work for a man than a woman. And so this question of women in leadership, well, is that perception true, I guess, first? If it is true, what do women leaders have to do to help diminish that perception that some women would not would prefer to work for men than for women?
Can I turn the question back on you just a second? So, did they say why?
Men were easier to get along with. They weren't. They felt some women perhaps were more inflexible. They were more demanding. Those kinds of.
So now I want to ask the women in the room. I'm going to go back to some clinical experience that I have with couples, and just as this is an observation, this is not research-based, this is more clinical observation. One of the things that I saw as a very common theme was that women, for whatever reason, I don't understand why, would become very critical of their husbands and very critical of other people. And men would become quiet. When there was conflict, men tended to withdraw and women tended to verbalize and become more critical. I don't know if that replays itself in organizations. But it may be that it feels not quite as safe because of that nature, or I don't know if it's nature or nurture, how we get to it, if it's our society. And I would kind of turn that back on you. Is that what they're referring to? Does it feel more critical? Did it feel less safe to be authentic and to be genuine? Because I saw numerous men that would pull back and become very, very quiet because they were going to be in trouble no matter what they did, is the way they would describe it. And so they would do nothing, which then, of course, would infuriate the women even more. But I don't know if that's that same dynamic, or if what they're referring to. And maybe it's because the women felt like they had to be strong, and then the backlash on being strong and being assertive, that could be part of that as well. That even women will feel that assertiveness in a more negative way from another woman, then they would feel that very same critical or outspokenness in a man. But that's it's really more of a hypothesis and guessing. I would like to hear what other people have to say.
I'm glad you posted it that way, because it doesn't resonate with me. It doesn't mean it isn't true. I'm going to pose the alternative hypothesis, and that is, at least in my experience, my male supervisors I think they didn't identify with me quite as well, and therefore they were a bit more hands-off. And I don't know if that's just the generation that I came through, whereas women, we communicated a lot more, and so there was a lot more interaction. And I just, as a hypothesis, if it's even true, so we have to go back and evaluate our assumptions here. If that's even true, I just wonder if that's a component of it.
I'd also go back to that research on women leaders, that we have different expectations of women leaders than we do of men, in the sense that we were talking about the likability competence dynamic there. And I think that, and we also have implicit bias, and women have implicit bias against women just as much as men have implicit bias against women in leadership positions. So I think some of that is just an expression of their unconscious bias, that once they really reflected upon it, I think there would, and you looked at the expectations and got it down to the behaviors, I think I'm wondering, and one hypothesis I might have is that we, as women, have a relational expectation, and it's interesting to maneuver through a power dynamic with the relational expectation too. So it's much easier to have a male as a director in some ways than a female, simply because we don't have that relational expectation with that male. That would be part of my hypothesis, but I also think it's implicit bias wrapped in that too, that women share against women.
It was in the bathroom, Sharon, that said we needed to be honest in this room and not hold back. So, of the women in the room, how many of you would feel more uncomfortable with a woman direct supervisor than a male?
That's fair.
How many feel the opposite? They would feel more comfortable with a woman supervisor than a male?
How many people don't know?
How many people? I would say it depends, right? It depends.
Robin's like, not going to
Depends
answer
on the
that.
person.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Laura Wolf. I'm also with Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and I was very curious and interested in the differences we learned about biologically, chemically in the brain. And I'm curious if the panel has suggestions of when you are trying to communicate with others in your agency. If you're a woman, are there suggestions on how to best get your point across or best communicate with men? And likewise, how do men maybe change how they would communicate so they can best get their ideas across to women?
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting, one of the exercises that we have done is interaction styles. And it's a pretty big deal within our organization to understand that we all have these different interaction styles. And we all take this test, and we all learn what our own interaction style is and what the interaction style is of others that we work with. What I will say is when you look around the room and there's like 4 primary interaction styles, it's really quite mixed. There are men and women who are both what we call get things going type. There are men and women who are in charge. So it's really, for me, it's not necessarily about the gender. It's about understanding that people have different interaction styles. And to be successful, you really need to both understand your own and also understand others. You know, if somebody is a behind-the-scenes kind of person, you're going to need to recognize that they're going to need time to process what you're saying. And other people are going to be much more comfortable just going on the fly and coming with whatever comes to their head. But it's not a gender, it's an interaction style. So that's my take on it.
Amen. Yeah, agree.
And I'll just say, I agree with that. Usually I follow up a gender workshop with using a disc profile or some interaction workshop to say, okay, now we're going to take a look at the next level of individual differences. I think it comes back to self-awareness, knowing yourself. If you know yourself well, then you can also then educate other people about what to expect from you and what that means when you're communicating. And I think that kind of setting the stage helps people know where you're coming from. And, but it comes back to knowing yourself and being able to communicate that to other people and owning that. It allows you to be authentic and allows other people to accept that within you.
I hate to admit this actually, but I think there was one tool that I learned in my marriage counseling that really worked. And that is, this is what I think I heard from you. And repeating that really does clarify it, because a lot of times you aren't communicating. And so it is a little trick they teach you, and it's a useful one that I've taken and applied in my job, and with my students in particular too.
Yeah, I think that recognizing that the interactions of the people that you're that you're having the conversations with. Everybody is different, and you take the different tact with different people. My communication style, and Robin's out here, she works with me, she can tell you, it varies. I try to be authentic with everyone, but my tactics are very different depending on who I'm talking to. Some people respond very differently. It's got nothing to do with gender, males and females, or they just, the way they respond is differently, and you got to know yourself, and you have to be willing to get to know them, what makes them tick. And I think that's a fundamental, at least in my role, a fundamental thing that I think is lacking a lot. The job is very high-paced. We got to get a product out. We got to get things going. And so we miss the human side of what we do, and we miss what makes our employees tick, what makes our externals tick. And that's just as equally as important as everything else we're doing. Ultimately, your objectives will fail if you don't know who you're working with. So I try to get to know, if it's hunting and that's what you need, to get you that common language. If it's, trying to get to know their kids or, and again, that's a little bit of a stretch for me, but I try really hard to understand that. All those things I think are just collectively help you maintain those relationships and keep that line of communication open between anybody you're talking to.
My name's Gillian Wigglesworth. I work for BLM, and I come from a dual career family with children 0 to 5, which we know is some of the most impressionable time. And one of the challenges that I think most parents have is just how to really be there during that time. And my question for the panel, and interestingly enough, I'm really interested in specifically the men, is how you have worked through maybe professional challenges that may have come up during that time when you are trying to balance with your wife. And on the other hand, for the women on the panel, if there's any magic key to whether it's, or what your approach was to supervisors for a change of schedule, whether it was really taking time off, a part-time schedule, a job share, something that might help accommodate that work-life balance during that 0 to 5 years. And that's where the policy really takes you for 3 to 4 months, and then the community is raising your children. And that's fine if you can afford this or that and it's close to your house. So just your input on that would be great.
Well, I went through that time period just a few years ago, so I'll comment. I had two young ones in that same time frame not long ago with a working spouse. One of the things that really helped me and that I advocate to young parents with young children is, for us anyway, it was I don't want to say a chaotic time, but a really, really stressful time for a lot of reasons. And I think what I started doing was taking what I called writing weekends. And so I would take a 2 or 3 day weekend and I would go away. I'd go stay at a friend's house who was out of town or whatever, and often in the same town. I wasn't really going away. I was just getting the heck out of my household. And so, and then when I would come back refreshed. I had gotten a lot of work done. I had not had to change diapers. I was rejuvenated and ready to, and then I would encourage my wife then to do the same. And so I think, for me anyway, getting away from my own children for a little bit was very helpful, because then I wasn't, when you go to work and you come home and there's just kids and diapers and chaos, and you just, they're 24/7. And so I think my wife and I both found that to be very helpful. It ends up spending less time with each other, but then the time you do spend is more meaningful because you've spent a little time away from each other. So anyway, that's one strategy that really worked. And I think if you just are always in the trenches and no one's getting away, your tolerance and your temper and your emotions don't get a break.
I'd agree with the self-care aspect of that everybody has to carve out some selfishness during that time, and I use that word purposefully, because a lot of people think of selfish, I think, as a negative word, and I think sometimes we're not selfish enough. So giving yourself permission to be a little selfish and to take care of yourself during that time. The other thing is I'd say is whatever you're doing, be fully present in that activity. I think sometimes we get so many things running through our heads. We're with our kids. We're trying to juggle something with work. We're trying to figure out something going on with our parents. You know, you've got a million different things, and it's learning to be focused right there where you are. If you're with your kids, be with your kids. And I think, you know, electronics, whatever, we try to juggle too much in our society. And if we can compartmentalize, when you're at work, do your work. When you're with the kids, be with your kids. Be fully present in whatever activity you're doing, and you'll be a lot less stressed out.
So as a mother who had 2 kids, they are now much older, I can certainly relate and would agree that that sort of 0 to 5 age can be the craziest, most intense, although I would say that need for some of the same things, the flexibility that we talked about, I think exists throughout. And again, I don't think it's just a woman issue. I know having a conversation with my boss after I had my first child and talking about how my husband, who's also a professional, we were going to juggle this. And he made, you know, a point of a comment about saying, this is really important to women in our workforce. And I said, this is really important to parents in your workforce, because my husband was struggling with the same thing. How do I be engaged as a father, and how do I juggle all this? So I think some of the strategies we talked about today from a workforce standpoint are really important. I know as both a boss and as an employee, one of the things that I've always really tried to do and help my employer understand, and then understand as a boss, is that I was in it for the long haul, right? You know, when I think back on it, you know, those 0 to 5 years, it seems like it was just yesterday, you know, 25-year profession. And if we're really talking about keeping talented people in the workforce, we have to have a big picture. And that's going to mean different things for different people in their lives, but we need to understand that we're investing in them in the long haul. And I made it clear to my employer, I'm in this career for the long haul, but here's some things I'm going to be dealing with in the interim time frame that are going to require some flexibility. And as we talked about earlier, that might be elder care for people, it might be child care for people, it might be different places where their spouses are, but we really have to be wise enough to recognize that there is a great need for good employees, and as an employer, being able to accommodate those needs is going to benefit the organization in the long run.
I don't really have anything new to add, but I have to say that 0 to 5 was actually, in my mind, a lot easier than it gets after that. Started racing around to all the soccer games and all the dance lessons and things like that. But what I was able to do during that time period was compartmentalize. It was clear who my priorities were. And when they're young and dependent on you like that, to me, I could set time aside and, as Tom said, really devote to my kids during that time period. And those where you hear the quality time, that really is important.
I think the last piece that I add to that, you mentioned that policy was good for the first 3 months. I'm like, oops, that tells us something about our agencies and our institutions if our policies are only helping families with the first 3 months of their family engagement. So I think the other piece is it sounds like you may be a pioneer, and it means that you need to go back to your leaders, and hopefully this conversation will facilitate the ease of doing so and saying, I am committed to the agency. This is my dream. I'm passionate about it, and I have 3 to 5 year olds or whatever they are, and I'm going to need some flexibility. It sounds like in talking with you previously, you have a solution, and it's about documenting for your employers again how that solution could really work to continue to capture not just yours, but the other individuals that you that you've spoken with and gain their loyalty and engagement in the agency. So I think you're primed. Just be resilient and do it again, ask again.
Could I ask a question before we go on? This 4 months, what is that referring to? Maybe I'm, in from White North. What is the 4 months? Is there a typical policy of?
I was just lucky enough to have an extension. Instead of the 12 weeks, I had another 4.
Usually it's 12 weeks, I think.
So 12 weeks. In Canada, we get a year. And if you go to the, Sweden and Norway, some guy came up to me and said, I really can't make your talk. I have to have my massage. That's part of my job this week.
All right.
Okay, well.
My name's Mary Tara Burns. I work with Idaho Fish and Game. I've been with them for 13 years, but I've been in natural resources for over 30 years. And there are certain individuals that refer to me as the dinosaur biologist. And I'm going to deviate a little bit early on in my career because, as you can see, I'm vertically challenged. I'm not very big. I was actually smaller back then. And I was, there was not only the gender issues, but there was the size issues. And I'm just wondering in any of the research if that's come up, because I've had where I show up for a job and you could see panic in their eyes because I was small. And I've been turned down for jobs and was told directly I was turned down because I'm not big enough. And I actually was, and it was with the Forest Service.
Shame on us.
Forest. And actually a job I had out of Stanley, the individual was checking in. I was new, I was learning how to ride a snow machine, and I did quite well. I got it, you have to master the thing. But the person running the program said, well, what is she, an Amazon that she's picking it up that fast? So anyway, I'm just curious if in the research there's been anything that's come out about that.
There's some interesting social science research about size and credibility and leadership, and certainly the smaller you are, the more psychological and social presence you have to have. Your voice is also fairly soft, and so it's interesting to think about the ways that I have a very good friend that's very small. She happens to be Asian, but she's chair of their department, and she has learned to physically take up space by the way she stands, the way she delivers her message. So she, ironically, sadly, has to compensate for her stature in making a bigger presence elsewhere, and to convey a competence that those of us who are tall, we get the implicit bias in our favor simply by being tall. It imbues leadership benefits.
Well, if I'm really honest, I have to say that in field work, I do consider strength, but it isn't that I exclude people, women, because I don't have the strength, and I know that, but I also find that I'm always thinking 2 steps ahead so I don't get myself in trouble, whereas I pulled out many more males who just ran through the mud holes.
Did I mention that women have better prefrontal lobes in general?
So, and unfortunately, I come at it from a practical standpoint that it's me ensuring their safety. And so I sometimes pair people, but I also get to know the individual, and I go out in the field and I see what their capabilities. If they have a lot of common sense, then I'm much more comfortable with that. But it is a safety issue for me.
Well, I will tell you, it actually made me chuckle when you were talking about this, because particularly when I was the director of DEQ, I cannot count how many times when I met people, they said to me, you sound so much taller on the phone. I personally just learned to chuckle at it and move right along.
Hi, my name's Jamie Hughes. I was a grad student at Boise State a year ago, but currently unaffiliated. My question to the panel is, I was at the TWS annual meeting in Hawaii a couple years ago, and on the night of the Women in Wildlife banquet, I met a young woman who, mid-20s, she was a grad student who was adamantly against the idea of this banquet and thought it was ridiculous, and people should be hired because of what they can do and not, what's between their legs, which I'm sure everyone here can agree with. And I made the argument that diversity, in the workplace can be a really valuable thing. And although I agree with her that, the best candidate for the job should get it, diversity is definitely an asset. So my question for the panel is, for someone who doesn't quite, accept this diversity argument, either, gender, sexual orientation, or workplace, what other points of discussion could you bring up for someone who doesn't inherently already think that that is something that the workplace needs?
I think I'd start by the definition of what is the best. There's a sense that we're all looking for the best, but each of us has a different idea of what best is. And I think best is a social construct, and social constructs are rife with implicit bias. And the more we can understand the platforms from which we start, I think the more equitable the conversations equitable conversations can be had, structures can be put in place to minimize the different platforms from which we start. And so I guess I'd start with that conversation a little bit more in terms of, yes, we all want the best, but let's take a look at what is best to you, what's best to me, and then recognize that it's a social construct, and let's talk about gender and how it's constructed in our culture.
I don't know how many times I've heard this within the Forest Service, and that is, we should be hiring based on skills and abilities, and I don't disagree with that one bit. And I think for this workshop, we weren't turning men away at the door. This was about leveraging differences and recognizing them and having a conversation. And I don't think that anytime those conferences and symposiums, it's always good to be learning, to be engaging, to be learning more about yourself, to be learning more about the environment that you work in. No one's saying that anyone's getting a leg up on a job and that's the intent of the conference or the workshop. At least let's hope not, certainly not in this case. And I don't even think we realize those biases that we have on a daily basis. It's not brought up to us until, we have these conversations and we're able to have some deep thought about it. And with that in my mind, you always have more clarity of thought and an elevated level of where you should be engaging. So to me, that's the real benefit of workshops and conferences and this kind of dialogue, not to leverage one gender, one race, one sexual orientation over another to give them a leg up in any way. It's to have that active dialogue and to understand those biases and get to know that environment that you're in. So that's the kind of conversation I would have tackled with that individual in Hawaii. And hopefully that would have helped turn her around a little bit to think a little bit differently.
I guess I would say that is to not have to take gender diversity into account is a luxury that we strive for, but the important thing is to not get to a point where you need to talk about it.
That's right.
And so, at our opening session on Tuesday, I counted, which I often do, and we were over 80% male in that room at the beginning of our conference on Tuesday. So, you can't refute those numbers. You can say that's fine, or you can say that that's not fine. Everybody's going to have their opinion. You're not going to change everyone's opinion. Not all of us are going to agree on any topic. But I was at a previous institution where the faculty was 95% male, and so it was perceived by enough people that it was a problem that there was a targeted woman only hire, and those are very controversial. And so the key is to not get to that point, because it's always going to be divisive when you get to that point. So don't get to that point. Deal with it ahead of time. Deal with it in small steps so that you don't get to a point where you look around the room and you realize we kind of got a problem, people are pointing their finger at us, and we need to solve it, because solving it can be divisive.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is that I think for a person like that, helping them understand that really when you step back, we're talking about diversity across the board makes us better at problem solving. And if you care about solving the problems for your agency, the organization that you're working from, or the science, you've got to care about having diversity of thought in that room in order to solve that problem and come up with more creative, different approaches that you wouldn't have if any room was made up of people that all sort of came from similar backgrounds and similar thought processes.
I'm Michelle Bouclay. I've worked for Idaho Department of Fish and Game for about 20 years. And Rita, you're uppity perhaps, but I'm nonlinear. So I first want to thank Tom. You've explained a lot. My older brother and I, our mother is a psychologist, and she, to this day, is extremely proud that she raised 2 androgynous children.
It was in vogue. I'm so confused.
Anyway, I could go on. There were always 2 boys or 2 girls. You know, it's just amazing. Anyway, I wanted to pick up on a thread maybe that Gretel, you started a little bit, and our conversations here are about maybe the implicit bias within our agencies. I would argue that for, at least in my agency, and a lot of us here work for public service agencies, that the unconscious bias actually affects the way we communicate with and engage with the people that we serve. And so I'm curious if you have any observations about that, or research or case studies, and then also if there's any suggestions on how to start to tweak that.
I'm happy to comment in. What that brought up for me was the 100 best companies to work for practice. And maybe it's a little different take on what you're saying, but what they found was that when they were responsive to the needs of and crafted diversity within their institutions, what they actually crafted was phenomenal customer service, because they were able to reach out to broader constituencies. They created a loyalty and a morale within the business that was transferred to the service that was provided to the customer. So I say that the more comprehensive and supportive an agency, you can craft a platform of support for the employees, it's going to be manifest, because diversity issues are going to be a matter of conversation. And so, so policies and procedures, engaging with leadership, inviting creative, innovative solutions, and not assuming that we already have enough on it, we already have the answers. I think right there, we're going to then engage a broader audience, which will then engage a broader customer service. It's all chicken and the egg and works together. That would be my start.
I am Anna Oshak. I've worked in the wildlife field for 20 years, for Idaho Fish and Game, for almost 20 years. But I also come from an agricultural background. Both fields are very highly gender-rolled and lots of implicit biases in action, which I'm happy to say these are changing. But as you talked earlier, self-awareness is key for our biases. But we all know that self-awareness and the empathy to be able to see it from another perspective don't always rise to the occasion until the crisis hits, or after the crisis. What other tools or actions are there that we can take to help both ourselves and each other see our implicit biases at work in our daily interactions and in our decision making?
There's a couple tools. One tool in particular is a Harvard-based implicit bias project, which I think Toni made mention. That's something that you can go online and you can share that tool. It's a way of tapping into how much implicit bias you might have personally. It's just a self-exploration tool. It's a variety of venues for exploring that implicit bias. One is gender and STEM. They've also got race and STEM and religion and a whole host of things that you can explore and learn more about yourself. And I think in terms of actual, I'm thinking about an agency and about where implicit bias comes in. It comes in at recruiting, it comes in at availability of resources, it comes in at, we call it PNT, but promotion and tenure, or any sort of promotion process that you have in your agency. So wherever there's critical decision-making points, and you know where those are, that's where it's important to have each member of that community who's making the decisions have some sort of training, dialogue, case study engagement that helps them put in critical reflection points. We're finding that the best way to interrupt implicit bias is to require conscious what-ifs or Lincoln Cabinet approach, which was he innately put on people that said were naysayers, and required people to reflect on why that decision was a good decision, and is there any way that was not a good decision? So you could begin to explore possible biases that come into the decisions that are made. There's a book out there called something about mind bugs, but it looks at how we are cognitively engineered, which, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Tom, sort of gave us one insight into the way that our perceptions are biased, but we're hardwired in a lot of ways that bring in perceptual biases. So learning about the mind bugs that influence our cognitive processes and behaviors can be very helpful, and engineering them into trainings for decision makers.
And along with that, then some of the work that I do is in emotional intelligence in leadership and emotional intelligence in the workplace, and bringing those types of concepts into your workplace and having discussions about those, and self-awareness, self-management, and relationship awareness and relationship management, how to really build those skills so that you can get to know yourself and manage your teams better. So that would be another thing, and that's the term emotional intelligence was coined by Daniel Goleman. There's a book called Emotional Intelligence that was written in 1995. Now it's almost 20 years old, but it was the cornerstone of that movement. And so it gives you a framework to kind of understand yourself and the people around you.
So I completely agree. I think, training and awareness is a huge factor. I think it was said earlier, it is hard. State agencies are sort of big organizations. How do you make the movement within those organizations? And that's what I was going to say. If you had a limited budget, and this is from a perspective of somebody who spent 9 years as a director of an agency, if I had a limited budget and I was to say where would I really put my limited time and money, I will go back to something that I said earlier today, which is really good training on this issue for first-line supervisors. Because my experience is that is the line at which really makes a difference in your organization. I used to be frustrated at the inability to get women up through the ranks, but the reality is if you can't get them to the first line of management, you're never going to get them beyond that. And that's where those first-line supervisors are making huge impacts. So if I had limited focus, and that's the only place I could do it, that's where I personally would be putting my resources.
Hi, my name is Sadie, and I go to Sage International School, and I'm in 10th grade. And so I do a lot of research, like self-research, on like females in our society. And so I've recently begun to associate myself with the feminist title, and I was wondering if you guys claim that title, and why or why not?
Good question.
Good question.
She's He's asking for feminists. And it's such a loaded question. There's such a fabulous connotation to it and a not so fabulous connotation.
Exactly.
And I'll share just a quick story. The first feminist I knew was my father, and he actively embraced it. He would tell me I'm a feminist, and he would expose me to feminist thought leaders. And so I embraced feminism because he embraced feminism. It meant something positive to him. It meant equitable treatment. It meant working for social justice, working for families, all these positive things. I think our culture has also begun to ascribe feminazis to it, and the uppity women and the negative pieces. And do I ascribe to that type of feminism? There's a part of me that says, no, of course I don't want to be associated with that unlikable feminazi person. And yet change requires us to be courageous enough to speak out, to be then perceived as an uppity woman. So I guess at some level I will embrace the title of a feminist as defined as a person that's very much interested in social justice and equity in the world. And with that definition, I leave it to you to say whether you're a feminist or not.
I would say that I agree with you that if that's our definition, then yes, I'm a feminist. And I think I go beyond that, and I'm a humanist. And so I think that's the next stage in that, is how do we all become equal, and how do we become equal without tearing other people down? And unfortunately, there was part of the feminist movement that went to the point of tearing down men. And so that's the part of me that has a hard time embracing that. But that doesn't mean that it was okay that the way things were before the feminist movement came along.
And I guess I would say I tend to avoid labels because I think, unfortunately, it empowers people to make a snap judgment. So whether that's feminist, conservative, liberal, whatever, I think there's much deeper, important issues to be discussed under that. And I think sometimes if you get a label attached to it, people can make those snap judgments exactly without asking the really more important questions.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was raised, Greta, I'm glad you said that. My father, who I said was one of my mentors, he grew up with a very strong mother. And I'll just say that my grandma was who taught everyone how to hunt and fish and provide for the family. And I have an agricultural background as well in southern New Mexico, so it's chili and cotton, and she's the one who ran those crews. So he was raised that way, and he taught his girls to have that attitude. And I wouldn't say he ever called us feminists. He said you need to be strong and know who you are, have a good sense of who you are in society. Don't let anyone label you. Take it a little further within my culture. It is more rare to be outspoken. It is more rare to pursue a career and not a family, and stay home with your family. I think that being a parent is one of the most important jobs in the world. But he said, you got to know that equality there, and you got to balance that out and know your place. And so, again, I never labeled myself as a feminist. I've just tried to have a good sense of who I was, and I don't think you're going to see me burning my bra or anything like that.
My name's Eric Crawford. I'm a senior conservation officer, so inherently I'm part of that other segment of the agency that Beth mentioned earlier. So I'm part of the Law Enforcement Bureau, which is even more gender biased, and it's not necessarily on purpose. And so where is the division between bias and almost sympathy and empathy? In addition to being an officer, I'm a field training officer, which requires spending time with a new hire, one of our new officers, on the outskirts of 4 weeks, and so 3 weeks, no matter what. And so that's day in and day out relationship. And so now we've gotten to the point that we have 4 females that are commissioned field officers. And so where is that balance between empathy and empathy, but not being biased?
I think it really comes down, and again, this is a an opinion of mine, not necessarily research-based, comes down to judgment. And what I mean by judgment, being critically judging somebody else or negatively judging somebody else. When it starts to become, if you can be empathy or empathetic, and empathetic means understanding somebody else without judgment, without negative criticism. When we get something in there that negatively affects another person or turns our judgment against them, now you have become biased or discriminatory. So it's without judgment.
So let me expand that then. So Dr. Tom, so they're evaluated on 29 categories on a daily basis, okay? And so one of those is officer presence, okay? And so as we heard, from Mary's comments that she's been ridiculed because of her size. And so again, you're trying to be fair and evaluate them on the same scale that our expectation is for all of our officers. And so, but there is more of there would be more of an emphasis to step in before it escalated, the contact escalated to a point that likely a female couldn't deal with. So that really
So one of the things is, as much as we try, we will never get rid of bias and unconscious bias. The more we make it conscious, the better, but it's going to be very difficult to completely remove it as a human condition. And I don't know where that line is in the example that you've given, because there has to be some judgment. You're evaluating people, but when is it fair judgment versus biased judgment? And I'm not sure that I have the answer to that.